Hello, I am here to finish reading The Explorer by Catherine Brundell. In my English group, we have been reading this for quite a long time and it seems a real shame not to finish it. So feel free, if you're not in my English group, to listen to the end of the book. I'll give you a quick rundown of what's happened so far. So there are 4 children on an aeroplane with a pilot, obviously, flying the plane, and they are travelling from England to Manaus, which is in Brazil. On their way, the plane crashes. It crashes into the Amazon rainforest. The pilot unfortunately dies, and the children have to learn to survive on their own. We've got Fred, Con, Lila and Max. Lila and Max are brother and sister. Max is only 5 years old. And they learn lots of new things. They come across a sloth, a baby sloth called Baka. And Lila takes real good care of Baka and he goes everywhere with them too. Later on in the story, they come across a hidden city in the Amazon rainforest, and Fred is so excited about this because he's read so many books about explorers who travelled to look for these cities that are hidden deep in the rainforest. And they also they find a man, and this man at first isn't pleased to see these 4 children who are hungry, tired, desperate to get home. The children, on the other hand, think, oh, an adult. Oh, thank goodness. They will take us home. They'll help me get home. Not as easy as that. The explorer will only let them go home if they promise not to talk to anybody about where they've been and what they found. In the story, the children all agree to this apart from Fred, who has his father at home who isn't as loving as a father would usually be, and he thinks that if he tells his father about where he's been and what he's done, all these amazing things in the rainforest that he's done, his father will be so proud of him. So I'm going to carry on reading. The children have been learning to hunt. Now, I'm not quite sure where we got up to, so I'm going to go from fishing in the dark. The explorer hadn't moved by the time the sun rose. He lay, snoring, where they'd left him, a beetle perched on his chin. Max woke up first and kicked Fred in the crotch as he scrambled to his feet. Max scratched himself all over and then went running across a stone square, shook the explorer's shoulder and sat down on top of him. The explorer startled awake. Fred flinched, remembering what the man had said about the startle reflex, but he merely looked mildly, politely appalled. "Can I eat this?" Max asked. He thrust a handful of grass into the explorer's face. The explorer shifted Max gently onto the floor, sat up and began to blow the fire. "No, you can't," he said. "You didn't even look." "The chances that the answer is yes are so slim." He looked up. "That's poisonous." "No." "Definitely poisonous or only maybe?" "Definitely." And this?" He held up the explorer's chin beetle, which had fallen on the ground. "You could eat that," said the explorer. He gently took the beetle from him. "But the Max of 2 hours from now would not thank you. As a rule of thumb, it's best not to eat things that are still moving." "Oh, but I'm hungry. It's only moving a tiny bit." I would still, emphatically, discourage it. "What does that mean?" "It means no." "Ah." Max lay down on his back. He didn't cry, but his face looked blank and older than it should be. Quietly under his breath, he began to sing to himself in Portuguese. Fred scraped some dew from the leaves above him and used it to clean his face. He looked over at Max, properly looked, for the first time in days. The boy was growing thin and his cheekbones stuck out under his eyes. Lila had worked hard to make him look cared for and clean, but he had a snail trail of snot across his face and green dust in his eyebrows. The explorer was also looking down at Max. His face was shaping itself into peculiar expressions. His eyes were bright and his mouth tight. Abruptly, he rose to his feet. His voice was brisk, artificially, unconvincingly brisk. "What are you all sitting about for? Time is precious. Shouldn't you be preparing for your journey?" But how exactly? We don't know what to do," said Con. Her voice was almost a whine. Lila shot her a look. The explorer's expression was very dry. "If you have a preference of surviving, you'll need to know how to spear fish. There have been expeditions when the men and I survived for fish for half a year." Max's face lit up. "Fish? Right now?" "Tonight. There's a small lake not far from here." "Oh, but I'm hungry now," said Max. "It needs to be dark. You can spend the day making spears." "I tried that," said Fred. He slapped away a mosquito. "But the vines I used to tie the flints on kept breaking off." "Vines?" The man looked shocked. "You don't use vines to secure a spear. That would be like using packing tape to build a steam train, idiot boy. You use intestines. Where are the guts from your bird?" Con pointed to the jungle, where they'd buried the intestines and other rejected bits at a safe distance. "Dig them up and heat them over the fire and use them as string." He made a winding gesture as if trying to tie a knot. "And don't bother me until then." He turned abruptly. They were getting used to it now and strode away towards the far end of the courtyard, towards the tangle of vines that cut off the corner of the square from sight. They undug the intestines. They were not a pretty sight, and being buried hadn't improved them. Con washed them in half a coconut, and Lila and Fred began laying them out on the stones, trying not to look too hard at the semi-translucent tubes. Max tugged at Lila's ankle. "Lila, did you hear that?" "What?" The air was silent, bar the constant whir of the insects in the trees above them. Then Fred jerked his head round. It was that same roar he'd heard before, choking through the air. "It's coming from there, from behind the vines," he said. "I'm going to go and see." "No," said Con. He said, "Don't bother me, and I happen to think if a person wears claws for cufflinks, you should do what he says." "But what if he's being eaten?" said Fred. "Surely then it doesn't count." Lila shook her head. "I agree with Con." Con looked round in surprise. "Really?" "Whatever it is, he doesn't want us to know, and we can't afford to make him angry." Lila turned with unexpected firmness towards the fire. "Let's make those spears." Reluctantly, Fred sat down. The morning was a sticky one, and nobody smelt better by the end of it. The intestines weren't easy to empty, and the process of heating them over the fire to harden them felt unexpectedly medieval. "This is not how I pictured fishing," said Con. "I thought it was all old men sitting round on river banks telling people to be quiet. Like river librarians." Fred opened his mouth to reply, but the guts dripped and spat hot fat at his teeth, so he shut it again. He wondered if his fingers would ever lose the faint scent of dead bird. But by the time the sun began to set, he had a long-handled spear with a flint glinting in the light. Lila's spear was strong and straight, but the wrapping around the flint had gone awry, where Bacca had tried to get involved in the process and covered himself in grease. Con's spear was the neatest. Her hands were competent and controlled, even with bird gut. Fred went in search of water to wash the grease off his arms. Some of the stones had hollows that collected enough rainwater to wash a small patch he'd moved from stone to stone across the site, gradually shedding the worst of the burnt grease smell. As he came back, he heard voices. The explorer was kneeling on the ground, bent over his pith helmet. Lila crouched next to him. You have to be gentle with his knees and elbow joints. The explorer was speaking, his voice low. They're still very fragile at his age. Lila nodded. I know. She reached into the pith helmet. I can feel it when he moves. They're so light, like seagull bones. Make sure you check under the armpits for parasites. There. Bacca's head reared up over the edge of the pith helmet and he let out a wail of protest. The explorer gave something approaching a smile. He's being unnecessarily dramatic. The water's good for him. Now, hold him by his forearms. Like this. Lila lifted Bacca from his bath, dripping, his legs dangling. Yes, check his stomach for ticks. Lila checked, brushing her fingers over the sloth's belly, her eyes squinting with care. There's nothing. Bacca's fur was plastered against his skull, and his eyes were wide with the affront of it. He gave a squawk as he hung from Lila's hands. Now you need to dry him. Swiftly, Lila unplaited her hair. It fell in an uneven wave to her waist. She lifted the sloth into it and rubbed him gently. Bacca snuffled among the deep brown curls. Fred saw Con, inside the stone room, give a ghost of a smile. Max was half asleep, his head on Con's lap. The explorer raised his eyebrows. The corners of his mouth lifted half an inch. I doubt that particular strategy would be suggested in veterinary college, but good. The sun was dripping over the top of the statue of the panther. The explorer looked up and saw Fred. He sprang to his feet, as if embarrassed to be caught mid-kindness, his bad leg catching on the good one, suddenly brisk again. Right, are you ready to go? You each need to take some fire with you. The fish eyes shine red in the light. Find slow-burning wood, something dense, or it'll burn down too quickly. They set off in single file through the dark trees, each carrying a burning branch. Bacca rode, still, slightly damp, inside Lila's shirt. The explorer moved without a single rustle. The rest stumbled behind him, stubbing their toes on unseen roots. A branch whipped in Fred's face and the leaves blackened the flame of his torch, but the wood was too green to catch fire. Don't burn down the jungle, please, said the explorer without turning round. Fred found to his surprise that the dark no longer seemed threatening. It still made his skin tingle, but the pitch-black shadows under the trees no longer bit at his stomach in the same way. The change had been slow, he hadn't felt it come. There are ant mounds everywhere here, the explorer said. Nothing too bad, the only dangerous ants are the bullet ants, but you don't want to disturb them if you can help it. I was attacked by a colony once when I was asleep. It looked like my whole body was covered in warts. Oh, said Lila. Wow. Quite. And not good for the morale. They went in the new direction, northwest, down a steep incline. Every time their branches burned down to their hands, they pulled new ones from the trees and lit them. Twice, Fred lost his footing and slid until he came up against a tree. Max tripped, ate a mouthful of mud, and they had to pause until his screaming died down enough for him to walk on. Lila tried to comfort him. The explorer turned away and studied a dung beetle with angry intensity. The lake, when they come upon it, was larger than Fred had expected. The trees that grew all around it had spread their roots under the water. The explorer took off his shoes and waded in knee-deep. Come on, quickly, he said. What are you waiting for? Fred followed into the water, feeling it soak his shorts and praying there was nothing in it with teeth. The lake was pure black except where his burning torch cast a yellow light down through the water to the mud and the stones of the lake bed. In the glow of the flames, pairs of red lights flitted and flashed under the surface of the water. Max laughed, delighted. The bigger the eyes, said the explorer, the bigger the fish. Move slowly towards them. Hold your torch close to the surface. You lower your spear as slowly as you can into the water and then, at the last moment, you jab. Jab fast. Don't jab your own feet. Now, split up. Lila and Con exchanged glances. They moved off across the lake, but they didn't split up. Their breath was audible. It was hard to tell in the dark, but Fred thought they might have been holding hands. Fred reached out for Max's hand and he took it. His palm was warm and sticky. "Let's fish," Max said. Fred fumbled, trying to arrange his spear properly while keeping the flame away from his face. "If I give you this torch to hold," he said to Max, "will you try not to burn my hair off with it?" Max took the burning branch. "Maybe," he said. The spearing was harder than Fred had expected. The spear was thin and supple in his hand, but every time he brought it down to over a fish, the fish had gone. A swarm of mosquitoes passed over them. Max sneezed and waved his burning branch over emphatically. "Max, I think I'd better take the branch." "No," cried Max. No, it's mine, I'll be careful." A spear flew suddenly past them, inches from Fred's chest, and landed in the mud of the lake, its tip vibrating out of the water. Fred jumped. Max gave a yell, rocked backwards, grabbed at Fred's knees, and the two of them toppled backwards into the shallows. The branch extinguished. Fred sat up, spitting water, and looked around for Max. The explorer strode past, picked Max up with one hand, flipping him upright, setting him down on his feet. "Are you wet?" asked Max. "I'm wet," he wailed. "I don't want to be wet." But otherwise?" Max's face rippled as he debated whether or not to cry. He hesitated, then, "My underpants are soggy, but I'm all right." The explorer picked the spear out of the mud where he'd thrown it. "Good boy," he said to Max. On the end of his spear was a big fish, as big as a man's thigh. "Breakfast," said the explorer. "Come here, Fred, and learn how it works. Max, stay on the shore and guard the fish. Here, I'll give you a torch." The explorer strode through the water to the nearest tree, pulled down a branch, lit it with his own, and handed it to Max. "Beautiful, no?" Should Max be left with fire?" asked Fred. "He tends to eat things." The explorer turned to Max. "Boy, don't eat the fire, or any other part of the world surrounding you. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Max. He was sniffing the fish. "You see, he understands," the explorer said. "Come on." Fred wrung the water out of his shirt and waded into the lake to stand near the explorer. The man seemed to be in a good mood. Fred risked a question. "When you go out into the trees—" "Yes." The explorer waded further in, the water lapping up to his thighs. Fred followed. The black water closed over his waist. "What are you doing there? You're gone all day, but you don't come back with any food. Are you hunting?" For a long time, the explorer didn't answer. Instead, he stared down into the lake. He was still that Fred wasn't sure he was breathing. "There, see?" He pointed down at the murky water and the submerged roots. Fred could see nothing, only floating leaves and the moon. The explorer's arm moved so fast, Fred didn't see it start or stop, but suddenly there was a long, thin fish flapping on the end of the sphere. He said, "Needle jaw, tastes like pike, lots of bones, but delicious." He took a length of twine from his pocket. It had a thin flint, sharp as a needle, tied to the end. He threaded the fish onto the twine. "You asked what I do during the days," he said. "I'm fixing the thing I broke." Then he pivoted on his heel and swept the subject away from the gesture. "Look, see how I grip it? Get the spear less than a thumb's height above the fish before you stab down." Fred stood hunched over the water. Red eyes glinted in the dark. He stabbed many rocks, some leaves, and his own ankle. Then, astonishingly, he felt the tip hit a fish. The first stab only hit the tail fin, but the fish was slowed and Fred stabbed again, frantically, until he felt the flint meet flesh. "I think I caught something." He held up his spear to the light. On the end of something wriggled. It wasn't large, but it was indisputably a fish. "Wolffish, they call it in these parts. Put it in your pocket," said the explorer. Fred checked to see if he was serious, but he didn't seem in a particularly jovial mood. So Fred put the fish in his pocket of his shorts. Its eyes stared up at him like a gym mistress. He waited for a moment, rinsing the fish blood off his hands before daring to try again. "Well, what are you fixing?" The explorer waded deeper into the lake up to his waist. He seemed to find it easier to speak here in the dark. "I was on a mission. I was flying, looking for any sign of life below. I was circling the city, trying to work out whether there was anything else to see, and my wretched engine failed. I crashed through the canopy. There was a fire, and it killed a lot of foliage." "What happened to the plane? Could you salvage it?" The man's eyes flickered down to the water, and he stirred his spear in the weeds. Fred tried again. "Is that what made the hole in the trees?" "In the canopy, yes, but the canopy was there for a reason. Whoever built this city had planted the trees so that their leaves interlock. You can't see the city from above. You could stand on a mountaintop and look down, and all you would see was uninterrupted green." "How long ago was it made?" "I don't know. With a city so entwined with a jungle around it, it's hard to be certain about a date. 100 years, probably several hundred more. It will take at least 50 to 100 years for those trees to grow again. I've cut down the burnt trees where I can and tried to replant in the same place." "I saw. There are new shoots down the middle of the square." "Precisely. But as you can imagine, cutting down a tree without a saw is not a relaxing pastime. It has taken time. Until the trees grow, I need to fix the canopy. I'm building a dust sheet of sorts, palm leaves and vines to cover the gaps I made. An invisibility cloak." "Is that what you do when you leave during the day?" "Exactly. It's slowish work." He stabbed, brought up a fish and threaded it onto the twine. The firelight cast the cuts and scars on his hands into sharp relief. "I'm erecting new portions every month or so. I've fallen out of the trees more often than is ideal, but it will be a complete green roof, a living protection for the ruins." "But protection from what?" "From people surveying the land from the air," he said shortly. "From people looking for El Dorado. From people looking to pack places like this into parcels of stone and sell them to curious ladies and gentlemen in Chelsea for the price of a bus driver's yearly wages. From people exactly like me." "Like you? But you're saving it." "No, I'm undoing my own harm. But God knows what I might have done when I was younger. I was hungry to have my name in black capitals on the front page of the Times." He glanced sideways at Fred. Fred shifted uncomfortably and looked very hard at the water. The explorer stabbed again. The fish was still writhing hard, and he had to smack it against the sole of his shoe to kill it. Perhaps it was this that made him flush red in the fire's light. "Europeans have said cities like this were impossible. Europeans never believed in a place like this. They believed the jungle could never have supported such numbers. They said it was too infertile and called it the counterfeit paradise." He paused, staring unseeingly at the fish on the string. The tribes of the Europeans were so small that people believed there could never have been great sweeping cities. They didn't realise the tribes they met on the river were so small precisely because they were more readily found by men like me, because European diseases were killing so many of them. Measles, influenza, God knows, I've seen enough of that. This place does not need more people like me. A deep red anger spread down his neck to his arms. Fred didn't move. He only listened harder than he'd ever listened to anything in his life. "My wife was born in a village in the jungle. We were young, barely 20. She breathed the jungle, wore the jungle. She died from measles soon after our boy was born." His voice was flat. "She caught it from a troop of Englishmen, amateur explorers." "And your son? What happened to your son?" "He would have turned 4 the week after he died. Cholera." The explorer stared at the dark. "This land could have once supported millions of lives, and one day the world will know that. The time will come, I hope, when the world values people as much as it values land. But for now, we do not need more men in pith helmets marching through the jungle towards us. He looked back at the path they'd walked. Neither the people who passed through the city nor the city itself would be safe. Fred's blood was moving faster than usual through his body. He wanted to speak, to say something that would stop the explorers from looking so fierce and so lost, but his voice wouldn't come. Which is why the man stabbed again at the opaque water, but this time he missed, and there was a shake of passion in his hand. I ask you again that you swear not to tell anyone about this place. I ask it with every ounce of my heart. Fred was glad it was dark, glad he couldn't see the explorer's face nor the explorer his. I swear I won't, he thought. How can you make someone see that you're not lying, that you mean it? I'll never tell, he said louder. I swear. The explorer bowed his head. Thank you, Fred. I didn't understand before. I thought it was simple. Extraordinary things are rarely simple. But if you're right about what would happen, if you're sure, I would never dare say I was sure, but I believe I am right. I believe it enough to swear by it. Then I swear too. The explorer gave a sigh. It sounded of things that Fred could not untangle. Thank you. I'll die before I tell, said Fred. I'll explain it to the others. And I'll say nothing about you ever. Me neither, said a voice. You're my explorer. I don't like to share. Fred jumped. Max had paddled back into the lake, still holding the torch, and was standing directly behind the explorer, rib deep in the water, preparing to hug his knee from behind. The explorer reared away, startled by the boy's hands. Good God! It's best not to show affection when you're holding a naked flame child, he said gruffly. He ruffled Max's hair. Max giggled and waded through the shallows towards Lila and Con, singing a song whose lyrics seemed to be comprised entirely of the word fish. The explorer handed Fred his spear. Here, try with mine. It's lighter. But what will you use? I don't technically need a spear. He crouched low, chest deep in the water, and lowered his hands up to his elbows. One hand flashed out through the water. There was a certain amount of thrashing. Then the explorer held up a fish the size of his forearm, clasped in both hands. Its scales shone in the moonlight. The only downside to doing it like this, he said, is sometimes they turn out to be piranha, and that can be awkward. Fred thought of his father back home, wrapped tightly in his pinstripe days. I wish you were my father, he muttered so quietly that the explorer could choose not to hear. The explorer turned, his eyebrows high. I would not wish that. I did not excel at that job, he said sharply. And Fred, it is possible your father will surprise you. It's in the nature of fathers. They're not as predictable as they seem. He is, said Fred. He stopped, but the darkness made it easier to speak. I wanted to tell him about this place. I thought he'd be proud. I'm sure your father is very proud of you already, said the explorer. He was looking down at the water, half listening. No, he isn't. Fred glared at the man's back. It's simple. He'd rather my mother had never had me. Then she wouldn't... It is not simple, Fred. The explorer turned and looked at him, full in the face. You must stop saying that word. Cut it out of your vocabulary. The complexity of it all is endless. Almost nothing in life is simple. Fred sighed. He was disappointed in the explorer. Adults always say that. It remains true. The world is larger than any human imagination. How could it ever be simple? He ducked underwater, his body disappearing under the black surface, and came up holding in his fist something resembling an eel, which thrashed against his chest. He went on as if nothing had happened. And man can love the fear of responsibility that comes with love. A secret that can be at once selfish and necessary. For God's sake, boy, truth is as thorny, as various as the jungle itself. He turned to crouch in the water again. Then, suddenly, he froze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Max, Fred, quick, out of the water. Con, Lila, get out of the water. Fred twisted to look round. Why? Out! His voice grew louder. Con and Lila started wading towards them. What's happening? Move faster. The explorer sprinted through the shallows, his bad leg dragging behind him. He grabbed Max around the waist, knocked Max's torch into the water and strode in fast, uneven steps towards the bank. Fred ran after them, tripping over submerged roots. Lila pulled Con along through the mud. The explorer dropped Max on the ground. His hand landed head first, but Lila scooped him into his arms before he could start screaming. The explorer turned, spear raised to face the lake. What's wrong? What did we do? Asked Con. Nothing. Now that the children were out of the lake, he sounded entirely placid. We're leaving. What is it though? See those eyes? They shine red like a fish there at the far side of the lake. Lila swallowed. Is that what I think it is? Her eyes must have been sharp. Fred could see only a flash of red and a grey shape. Caiman, said the explorer. It's an old one, maybe 8 foot long, probably not interested in any of you, but... He didn't finish the sentence. Have you ever been bitten? Asked Con. A few times. Come, we might as well leave rather fast. He tossed Max into the air, grabbed hold of one of his ankles and threw him over his shoulder. Follow me, you three. Put your feet where I put mine. Max, hanging over the man's back, foraged in his pocket. Fred, whispered Max from upside down, I have to tell you something. What is it? I ate a tiny bit of the explorer's fish while I was waiting. I was hungry. He held out the fish, which had his finger marks pressed into it. Is that all right? Fred looked at the creases in Max's face. Yes, he said. He tried to sound as serious as he could. I wouldn't do it again, but people do eat raw fish. I don't think you need to panic. I won't die. No. In fact, I think maybe, in a very peculiar kind of way, we're all safe, for now. The explorer twisted round to look at Fred, almost smacking Max's head against a tree. Yes, you are safe, he said. Or rather, he clarified, you could still die out here, but if you pay attention, you will be safe from a lot of things. He stopped, turning back to look at the file of children behind him, moonlit, sweat-smeared. He shook his head. There is no easy way to say such things as need to be said without sounding like a cheerleader. He did not, Fred thought, look very much like a cheerleader. Cheerleaders, he believed, wore fewer animal teeth. Do you see all this? The explorer held his torch high, casting a light on the trees and the sleeping birds. You don't have to be in a jungle to be an explorer, he said. Every human on this earth is an explorer. Exploring is nothing more than paying attention. That is what the world asks of you. If you pay ferocious attention to the world, you will be as safe as it is possible to be. He glared at them, each in turn. For once, Fred didn't flinch under the ferocious gaze. Speaking of attention, Lila, the explorer said, your sloth is trying to eat your hair. It will give it indigestion if it succeeds. Max's thin ribs bouncing against his spine, the explorer carried on home. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed.